In late October 2019, after months of overtime at my marketing job in Boston, I rented a small log cabin near Stowe, Vermont. I wanted nights quiet enough to hear my own thoughts and air that smelled like pine instead of exhaust. The place sat off a gravel lane called Tucker Road, 4 miles outside town, ringed by sugar maples lit up in red and orange. The host, Janice Evans, messaged that the nearest neighbor was about 50 yards away through the trees. She sounded proud of the seclusion. I was grateful for it. I left Boston before sunrise on Monday, October 27, followed I-93 until the mountains rose on both sides, and reached Stowe around 10 a.m. I stopped at the Shaw's on Mountain Road for groceries, then continued north on Route 100. A small wooden Tucker Lane sign leaned at an angle at the turn. Pavement ended after a quarter mile and my rental bounced along washboard gravel. The cabin appeared on the left like a postcard. Fresh log walls, green metal roof, a thread of smoke from the chimney. Through bare branches I glimpsed another house up the rise. A 2-story farmhouse the color of sun-bleached bone, all windows dark. I assumed that was the neighbor Janice mentioned. The key waited in a lockbox. Inside, the cabin smelled of cedar and old wood smoke. One room held a couch, stone fireplace, and tiny kitchen. A hallway led to a bedroom with a queen bed, dresser, and a single window looking toward the farmhouse. A sliding glass door in back opened onto a deck over a shallow stream. I dropped my bags, lit a fire from the stacked birch, and texted Janice that I'd arrived. She replied with a smile emoji and a reminder to latch the deck door at night. Black bears sometimes sniffed around. The rest of that first day I did chores I usually rush at home. Swept leaves off the porch, put groceries away, brewed coffee just to fill the place with the smell. By late afternoon, the sun dropped behind Mount Mansfield and the air turned knife sharp. I shrugged on a jacket and stepped out to watch the sky change. That's when I met him. He came walking along the tree line between the two properties. A man in his late 60s, cheeks red from the cold, gray hair flattened under a worn Vermont catamount's cap. He carried a silver thermos and raised a hand as soon as he saw me. I waved back, expecting him to keep going, but he angled toward my porch. "Evening," he said, stopping at the bottom step. His voice had that soft Vermont roll to the R's. Figured I'd introduce myself. "Name's Harold Jensen. I own the old white place next door." I told him my name, mentioned I was renting for the week. He chuckled that it was the right time of year to chase some peace. We chatted 10 minutes about foliage, early frosts, where to get the best apple cider donuts in town. He stayed a respectful distance, fingers wrapped around the thermos. Before he left, he tipped his cap and said he walked most evenings around 5 to stretch his legs. If I was ever out, he'd be glad for company. I said that sounded nice and wished him a good night. After he disappeared into the pines, I thought how wholesome it felt, like something out of a storybook, to meet a friendly local neighbor. The next morning, the windows sweated from the wood stove. I made bacon and eggs and spent hours on the deck with a paperback I'd been carting around for months. Crows called, the stream rushed below, and every so often an invisible car whispered along Route 100. Around 4, I hiked a short section of the Catamount Trail, loving the crunch of leaves under my boots. Dusk was settling when I got back. I lit the porch lantern. Right on cue, Harold stepped out of the trees. Same cap, thick canvas coat this time. He stopped a little closer to the steps. "Hope you found the trail all right," he said. His eyes were that watery blue that comes with age. I told him I had, then asked how long he'd lived up here. "All my life," he said. "Family bought the land before the war. World War II, that is," he smiled, half joking. "Quieter back then." We talked about Boston. His favorite team was Boston College hockey, and he teased me about hating Bruins rivals. When he lifted the thermos, I noticed his hands trembled slightly. After 15 minutes, he said he'd better let me get to supper, tipped his cap again, and walked toward the farmhouse. I watched him mount the porch, open a side door, and slip inside. A light blinked on behind a curtained window for a moment, then went dark. That night I slept without dreams. The only sound was the stream. On Wednesday, the sky turned flat gray and spit light rain. I drove into town, browsed Main Street, and ate at Butler's Pantry. Back at the cabin, I fed the fire and listened to wind push rain against the roof. Around 5:30, a light knock sounded at the door. Harold stood there, coat dotted with wet. "Figured I'd check you weren't drowning out here," he said with a thin laugh. I invited him in, but he shook his head. Didn't want to track mud. We spoke through the screen for 10 minutes. He asked what I was reading. I held the book up so he could squint at the cover. "Read that in college," he said, smiling. Later, I realized that put his college years in the late 70s, about right for his age. Before he left, he patted the doorframe and told me to be careful walking after dark. Coyotes followed the stream some nights. Then he vanished into the rain, leaving only damp footprints on the porch. Thursday was Halloween, though tourist season had mostly packed up. Morning fog wrapped the woods in white. I made oatmeal, guiltily cleared a single work email, and spent the rest of the day doing nothing. The silence thickened. After a while, I caught myself listening to my own pulse. Part of me was glad Harold would likely appear around dusk. The quiet was starting to feel like pressure. He came earlier than usual, about 4:30, wearing an old wool sweater that looked hand-knit. He waved, climbed the steps, and leaned on the railing. We traded small talk about a black bear spotted near Smuggler's Notch, the high school football team's record, the odds of snow by Thanksgiving. Eventually I asked, "Do you get many renters like me out here?" He shrugged. "Not so many. Not since everything that happened across the way." He jerked his head toward the farmhouse behind him. I waited, thinking he'd elaborate. He just stared into the trees. "What happened?" I asked. He opened his mouth, hesitated, then smiled like he'd chosen an easier answer. Trouble with insurance after some storm damage. Boards went up. Makes folks uneasy, I suppose." A quiet voice in the back of my head reminded me the farmhouse windows had looked dusty and dark since I'd arrived. Still, I'd definitely seen a porch light flare 2 nights before. Maybe he only used a couple of rooms. The sun slid behind the ridge. Shadows pooled in the clearing. Harold said he had to check his generator before the rain came back, lifted a hand in farewell, and left. I locked the door and stood there, unsettled for reasons I couldn't name. The cabin suddenly felt too quiet. I showered, boiled pasta, and watched steam halo in the cold air by the window. Around 8, I poured some water and opened my laptop to leave Janice a mid-stay review. It seemed polite. I wrote that everything was perfect and, almost as an afterthought, added, "Your neighbor Harold has been very kind each evening." The typing dots appeared, stopped, reappeared. Then a short reply popped up. "What neighbor?" Confused, I wrote back, "Harold Jensen, older gentleman in the white farmhouse next door." This time the dots lingered a long time. Her response was 2 sentences. "I don't know anyone named Harold. That house has been empty since the owner, Arthur Jensen, disappeared in 2016. It's been boarded up ever since." Cold crept up my spine. Not a jump scare exactly, more the way your stomach drops when a puzzle piece doesn't fit. I typed, "I've been talking with him every evening. He said he lives there." Janice replied almost immediately, "No one lives there. I can call the sheriff if you want." My first thought was that she had to be wrong, or I'd misheard the name. But Jensen isn't that common, and the farmhouse did look like it had been surrendered to weather and dust. I crossed to the bedroom window and parted the curtain. Moonlight picked the house out through thin branches. Every first-floor window was covered by rough plywood. No porch light, no glow inside. I don't know how long I stood there, breath fogging the glass. Long enough to picture Harold threading back through the trees, thermos in hand, watching my cabin from the shadows. The rational part of my brain insisted this was some misunderstanding. My heart hammered anyway. I messaged Janice to say I'd be fine. She told me to keep everything locked and call if anything seemed off. I shut the laptop and fed the fire until shadows danced on the walls. Sleep came in short bursts. Every log crack snapped me awake. Sometime in the deep hours, the flames sank to coals. Through the quiet, I heard footsteps on dry leaves outside the front door. Slow, hesitant, I held my breath. The sound stopped. The porch boards didn't creak. No hand tried the knob. The silence after felt heavier than the sound itself. My phone read 3:12 a.m. I lay there staring at the dark until pale light finally seeped around the curtains. Friday morning, I told myself there had to be an explanation. Maybe Harold was a caretaker and Janice simply didn't know. Or he was squatting in the old house without permission but friendly enough. I made coffee, burned my tongue because I drank it too fast, and decided to walk into town and clear my head. Halfway down Tucker Lane, I passed a little break in the trees and saw fresh footprints in the damp earth, larger than mine, edges clean, leading toward the boarded farmhouse. I kept walking. At Route 100, instead of turning toward Main Street, I crossed and headed for the Stowe Police Department behind Town Hall. The building looked more like a small library than a station. Inside, an officer at the front desk, badge reading G. Perrin, listened while I laid it all out. He asked for a description, height, hair, anything distinctive. I added the catamounts cap and the silver thermos. He nodded, said they'd checked the area, and told me not to approach anyone myself. He took my cell number in case. I thanked him, grabbed a sandwich from Green Goddess Cafe and went back to the cabin. The afternoon crawled. I tried to read but kept losing the thread. Somewhere plywood rattled in the wind and every thump made me jump. Clouds rolled over the peaks, turning the sky to wet slate. Around dusk, I half expected Harold to appear between the trees. The clearing stayed empty. I couldn't decide if that relieved me or not. At 7, heavy rain came in slanting sheets. I turned on every lamp like light itself could hold off dread. While a pot of soup warmed on the stove, I heard a dull thud outside, then another, more distinct, like weight testing each porch step. I killed the burner and held my breath. The pane beside the door showed only darkness and my own reflection. Then a voice came through the storm. "Evening, sorry to drop by late." My throat squeezed. It was Harold. Same cadence, but there was an urgency under it that hadn't been there before. "Could use a bit of shelter," he called. "Power's out on my side." Every instinct screamed not to open the door. Instead, I raised my voice as steady as I could. "I already called the police about you." Silence. Just rain on the roof. 30 seconds ticked past. I pictured him inches away, weighing his next move. When he spoke again, his tone had softened to something almost pleading. "I'm just your neighbor, friend. No need for police. Place gets lonely, that's all. You said we could chat." Another long pause. A single heavy footfall sounded on the bottom step. Then the sound of retreating steps, squelching through mud, fading toward the farmhouse. I stayed there until the acrid scent of burnt soup finally broke my trance. I dumped the pot, grabbed my phone, and called Officer Perrin's direct line. He said a unit was already on its way to check the Jensen property, about 20 minutes out, and told me to stay inside and keep everything locked. "Don't engage." I thanked him and hung up. Lightning flashed, turning every window into white glare for a heartbeat. In that instant, I saw a figure halfway between the cabin and the boarded house, standing motionless among the trees. The next flash showed only empty space. My pulse thudded so loudly it was all I could hear. Just after 9, red and blue lights swept up Tucker Lane. 2 cruisers stopped along the farmhouse's overgrown shoulder. Officers' flashlights carved beams across the sagging porch and warped siding. I watched from my window as they circled the building. One clambered onto the porch, tried the side door, and forced it. They disappeared inside. A few minutes later, they emerged, heads shaking. One gestured at the yard, tracks in the mud. Another followed them with his light until he lost them in thick undergrowth. Then Officer Perrin trudged to my porch, rain dripping off his hat. I let him in. "Someone's been inside," he said. "Found food wrappers, a bedroll, some personal items. No one there now. Thermos you mentioned was on the counter." I asked if the name Harold Jensen meant anything. He flipped his notebook. Arthur Jensen bought the place in '86. Reported missing December 2016. No immediate family on record. He cleared his throat. We'll keep looking. Likely someone using the property without permission. Might be a drifter pretending to be the owner. I almost told him Harold had said he'd lived there his whole life, that he knew small-town gossip and Boston sports, but the sentences died halfway up my throat. Perrin advised me to leave that night if I could. I packed in under 10 minutes, threw my bag in the car, and drove toward town with a cruiser behind me until I reached the Trapp family lodge, where Janice had reserved a room. Sleep came in jagged pieces. I kept jerking awake with images of wet footprints on my porch and a silver thermos on someone else's counter. By dawn, the rain had stopped. The mountains looked bruised under low clouds. I checked out early, grabbed coffee, and headed south for Boston. Near Waterbury, my signal came back. I had a voicemail from Officer Perrin. His voice was subdued. They'd found more upstairs in the farmhouse. Family photos of Arthur Jensen, including one from 1998 that matched the man I'd spoken with. They also found a death certificate. Arthur Harold Jensen, born 1956, presumed dead as of January 2017. They would keep investigating the trespassing, he said, but there was no sign of anyone currently on the property. If I remembered anything else, I should call. Back in my apartment that evening, I opened a photo I'd taken of the farmhouse on my first day. When I zoomed in on one of the upstairs windows, a little glint of metal showed in the corner, a blurred cylinder reflecting light. It could have been anything. My mind filled in the dented silver of a thermos. Weeks passed. Life shrank back down to deadlines, subway noise, neon outside my window. But sometimes when the city power flickers and my apartment falls abruptly dark, I hear that gentle voice at the cabin door again, asking to come in, saying it was only lonely. This happened when I was in college. I was 21 in early June 2021, fresh off finals at Western Washington University in Bellingham after 3 straight all-nighters. My roommates scattered for the summer. I had 2 dead weeks before my part-time library job started again. I wanted real quiet, the kind where you can hear your own breathing. So I booked a tiny cedar cabin on Airbnb. The listing said it sat on 5 forested acres off Lost River Road near Mazama, a speck of a town in northern Washington, a few miles from the Canadian line. The photos showed a single-room cabin with a wide front porch, pot-bellied stove, and huge windows facing into firs. It looked perfect. I left Bellingham on a gray Monday, took Highway 20 east through Cedro Woolley, and climbed toward Rainy Pass. Snow still clung to the shoulders. The sky cleared as I dropped into the Methil Valley. Cell service died somewhere after Winthrop. The road narrowed, cracked asphalt threading through towering Douglas firs. A hand-painted sign reading RIVERSONG pointed down a gravel track. My Honda rattled along for half a mile before the trees opened into a clearing. There was the cabin, fresh stained cedar, green metal roof, porch swing facing the woods. Mary, the host, a retired teacher, met me there. She lived in a larger house deeper among the trees. She handed me an actual key. "No Wi-Fi out here," she said, smiling. "Use the landline if you need anything. Cells don't work past Winthrop." I told her that was exactly what I wanted, thanked her, and lugged my duffel inside. The first evening felt like a meditation retreat start. I made coffee on the propane stove, sat on the porch swing, and listened to the Methil River roaring somewhere below the ridge. The air tasted of sap and distant rain. At 10, I lit the little wood stove, read by lantern, and fell asleep to cooling metal clicking. Sun woke me. Something outside the front window snapped me fully alert. On the moss, about 3 feet from the porch, sat a neat stack of stones. Each rock was about egg-sized, stacked into a tidy cone maybe 8 inches high. A squirrel or raccoon could have nudged stones around, sure, but this looked intentional. I went out, nudged it with my shoe. The stack collapsed. I shrugged, made oatmeal, and spent the day hiking a section of the Pacific Crest Trail near Cutthroat Pass. 6 cars at the trailhead, maybe 8 people total all day. That night was quieter than the first. No wind, river muted. Silence pressed against the cabin. I lay in bed listening, wondering whether anything lived beyond the walls at all. Somewhere after midnight, crickets started up again, and I drifted off. Morning light cut across the floorboards. I turned toward the window and my stomach dipped. Another stone pile stood in the exact same place. Same size, same shape, perfectly neat. A cold prickle crawled up my neck. Maybe Mary's grandkids were playing a joke, but she'd mentioned they lived down in town. No one had driven up. No car sounds at all. I went outside, snapped a photo even though my phone had no service, then kicked the stack apart harder than necessary. I spent that day kayaking a slow stretch of the Methau near Carlton. The river calmed me, but as I drove back up Lost River Road and saw the light fading, a knot formed in my gut that had nothing to do with whitewater. I turned down the gravel anyway. There was nowhere else to go. The cabin sat dark and still. I lit the lantern early, pulled the curtains, and tried to bury myself in a novel. Every 15 minutes I peeked through the fabric. Nothing moved, just trunks in deeper dark. Around midnight I told myself I was being ridiculous, blew out the lantern and climbed into bed. I wrapped the quilt tight and listened. A sound snapped me awake. Wood creaking under weight. The porch swing often swayed in wind, but this was different. Heavier. A single step that made the floorboards moan. I held my breath until my chest hurt. The cabin was one room, no interior doors to lock. Only the single front door stood between me and whoever was out there. Silence returned, thick enough to feel. Then a soft scrape, stone against wood, and nothing. Minutes crawled by. Eventually pale gray seeped around the curtains. Heart racing, I forced myself to stand, cross the room, and yank the curtain aside. A third stone pile sat on the porch rail, perfectly centered, directly in front of the window where my head had been. I stumbled back, gagging. That hadn't been there at midnight. Someone had stacked those stones while I lay 6 feet away behind single-pane glass. I slammed the curtain shut, threw clothes into my duffel, and jammed my feet into boots. My hands shook so hard I dropped my keys twice. Outside, the morning was damp and cold. I scanned the trees, sure someone would step out. Nothing moved. I thought about just driving away. Fear turned to anger, sudden and hot. I marched across the clearing to Mary's place. She answered in a robe, face creasing when she saw mine. I poured it all out. The stone piles, the porch creak, the scrape. She didn't tell me I was imagining things. She made coffee, sat me at her kitchen table, and called the Okanogan County Sheriff's Office. Deputy Ramirez arrived about an hour later. Late 30s, calm, voice low enough to steady me. We walked the perimeter of the cabin. He knelt at the porch and shined a light under it, then pointed to flattened grass. "Someone's been crawling under here," he said. He lay down and slid halfway underneath. When he backed out, he held a filthy blue sleeping bag, a crumpled protein bar wrapper, and a cheap LED flashlight with dead batteries. "Not yours?" he asked. I shook my head. He took photos, bagged everything, then led me behind the cabin. A thin path I'd never noticed wound into the trees. Bare earth and broken twigs showed recent use. About 50 feet in, the path opened into a small clearing. In the center rose another stone pile, taller this time, maybe 2 feet high. Beside it leaned a ragged army surplus backpack against a stump. Ramirez unzipped it with a pen. Inside were men's thermal pants, canned beans, a hunting knife in a cracked sheath, and a spiral notebook with many pages torn out. One remaining page was filled edge to edge with tally marks, and the words "Night Visitor" written over and over. My knees went weak. The deputy radioed for backup to sweep the area, then walked me back to the cabin. "Pack up," he said gently. "I'll trail you to the main road." As I stuffed the last of my things into my bag, he stepped onto the porch and frowned at the window. "Notice anything else?" he asked. The glass bore 2 faint handprints at face level, as if someone had pressed their palms there to look inside. I followed his patrol car down the gravel, every shadow along the road making my heart jump. At the paved road, he waved me on and turned back. I drove straight to a motel in Wenatchee, got a second-floor room, locked every possible lock, and left the light on until morning. That afternoon, Ramirez called. Detectives and a tracking dog had combed the property but never found the man. They followed footprints through the woods until they disappeared near a service road. "Looks like he'd been sleeping under that porch at least a week," Ramirez said. "My guess, he watches guests come and go, waits for someone alone, and edges closer each night." I asked if they had any ID from Prince or the notebook. "Nothing matched," he said. "We'll keep the evidence. Mary's putting up motion lights and cameras. I wouldn't recommend staying there again." Airbnb refunded my stay with a canned apology. Before driving west, I sat in my parked car and scrolled through the photos I'd taken the first day: cabin, river, sunset through trees. In one picture of the porch at dusk, something I'd missed before showed up. Between two distant fir trunks, a pale oval hovered. I zoomed in until the image broke into blocks. It was a face, featureless in the low light but unmistakably human, watching from the woods while I smiled at my own camera. He'd been there from the first night. The stone stacks weren't warnings. They were a measure of his courage, each night closer to the building. By the third, the stones touched the house. So did he. Back on Highway 2, I kept checking my rear view, even with midday sun blazing off the Cascades. Any car that stuck behind me more than a mile made me change lanes. Back in Bellingham, I slept on friends' couches for a week because my own studio felt too quiet. 4 years later, I still won't rent any place that advertises total isolation. I need neighbors, streetlights, the white noise of traffic, proof of human presence that doesn't sleep. People rave about silence. I learned silence isn't empty. It can hide footsteps already right outside your door. Years later, I still replay details. The first stone pile must have taken him minutes to build. He did it steps from my bed, confident I wouldn't wake. The second pile meant he'd come back after I scattered the first. The third meant he'd grown brave enough to build it on the porch itself, inches from the glass. I wonder what the fourth night would have meant. Ramirez guessed he might have tried the handle. Maybe only a scare. The knife in the backpack suggests otherwise. I asked Ramirez once if they ever found him. They hadn't. He figured a transient drifting between national forests, living unnoticed. The notebook and backpack went into evidence, cataloged under an anonymous case number. Then the trail went cold. Sometimes I picture hikers stumbling across an old campsite miles off trail, finding the same words scratched into bark, or stone towers built in deliberate little cones. Those images wake me sweating. Friends say I was unlucky. I tell them I was the opposite. Lucky the porch complained when it did. Lucky a deputy believed me. Lucky the man backed off instead of pushing harder. But I know luck is just chance in a mask. Chance put him under that cabin before I got there. Chance let him blend into the hush. I made it easier by choosing complete solitude. Travel blogs sell remote like a merit badge. Photos of tiny cabins under big stars rack up likes from city people who dream of quiet. I look at those pictures and scan the background for a pale shape between the trees. I still hike, still camp, but never alone, and never anywhere a scream would vanish into distance. If that means I miss the pure silence I once craved, so be it. Silence isn't nothing. Sometimes it's full of someone who has already come much too close. I have loved wild places as long as I can remember. My earliest memory is of standing on a worn porch high in the Colorado Rockies, sucking in air so clean it hurt. I was 8, drowning in a red parka 2 sizes too big, watching my dad haul fishing gear from the back of our Ford Bronco. The porch belonged to a tiny log cabin 6 miles west of Leadville near Turquoise Lake Road. My parents knew a neighbor who knew the owner, and for 3 summers we drove up from Denver to spend August nights there. I'd wake to elk bugling in the valley and fall asleep to wind hissing through lodgepole pines. Those trips pinned the mountains inside me. Whenever city traffic boxed me in and screens burned my eyes, my mind drifted back to that porch, the smell of sap, the sense that the world was still big and good. 21 years later, I needed that again. I just finished a brutal software rollout, takeout at my desk, nights blurred by fluorescent light. My head buzzed, my high-rise apartment felt like a humming cave. So I opened Airbnb, typed Leadville cabin, and there it was. Same sloped roof and rough-hewn railing. Same view of pine trunks slanting downhill toward a shimmer of turquoise lake. The listing said it had been renovated, solar panels, reliable Wi-Fi, but the porch, driveway, and setting matched the yellowed photos in my childhood scrapbook. The host's profile name was Heather. The description still mentioned the original owner, Alvarez. I booked 6 nights without hesitation. On Monday, September 5, I loaded my Subaru Outback with a week's groceries, a DSLR, and my aging golden retriever mix Porter, and headed west on US 24. The sky was pure blue. Aspens along the Arkansas River already hinted at gold. 90 miles later, I crested Tennessee Pass. The air temperature dropped 10 degrees. Every breath tasted like cold metal. By noon, I rolled into Leadville, topped off the tank, then took County Road 4 past the Sugarloaf Dam turnoff. Cell service faded to 0 bars right where Heather's instructions said it would. The old hunter green mailbox appeared on the right, number 204 still stenciled on the side. My tires crunched up the familiar gravel. The cabin looked smaller than I remembered, childhood stretches scale. The logs were darker, railings smoother from years of snow and melt, but it was the same place. I tapped in the key code. The lock clicked. Inside, late sun warmed the single room. A new cast iron stove sat where the stone fireplace once did. Fresh wiring hid behind pine paneling. The knot patterns in the floorboards hadn't changed. Porter circled a throw rug, sighed, and flopped down. I opened the windows to let mountain air flush out stale indoor smell, brewed coffee on a sleek induction burner, and let the day unwind around me. The first 2 days dropped into an easy rhythm. Dawn coffee, then a walk with Porter to Turquoise Lake Shore to watch the 10-mile range light up. A couple hours of code reviews on my laptop, a nap, then a late afternoon hike on the Timberline Trail, retracing routes my smaller legs once considered epic. Nights I sat on the porch with a headlamp and a paperback, listening to distant coyotes. No hikers, no neighbors, no car headlights, just the occasional thread of jet traffic scratching the stars. On Wednesday, September 7, the wind shifted. Gray clouds rolled over Mount Massive, threatening an early dusting. I pulled on a fleece and stacked wood by the stove. By 6, dusk folded over the cabin. Sleep began ticking against the roof. Porter snored at my feet while I answered a couple work emails. At 6:22, according to the cheap digital clock by my elbow, someone knocked hard on the front door. 3 knocks, a pause, 2 more. I froze. In 3 days, I'd seen no one within half a mile. I set my laptop aside. "Stay," I whispered. Porter was already up, tail low. Another knock, sharper. I eased to the window, staying out of direct view, and peered through the edge of the curtain. A man stood on the porch, late 30s maybe, tan canvas jacket darkened at the shoulders from wet. No hat, no gloves. I saw no vehicle through the trees, no tracks in the sleet. I cracked the door an inch, enough for my voice. "Can I help you?" He smiled too quickly. "Hey man, sorry. I'm not a stranger to this place," he said. "Stayed here last week with my girlfriend. Left something important. Any chance you can let me in real quick so I can grab it?" His story scraped wrong immediately. The calendar on the listing had shown no early September bookings. Heather lived in Buena Vista, and in our messages she'd bragged about being fully booked for leaf season. Guests who forget valuables usually say what they left. He hadn't. "Did you reach Heather?" I asked. He shook his head with a dismissive little snort. "She's not picking up. Look man, it'll take 30 seconds. He leaned, trying to see past me. Porter growled, a low rumble I rarely heard. Alcohol drifted off the man's breath. "I'm sorry," I said. "I can't let anyone in. You need to coordinate with the host." His smile thinned. "I'm telling you, I was just here. That lamp," he jabbed his chin toward a bronze lamp over my shoulder. "I know every inch of this place." I closed the gap another inch. "Have a good night." I slid the deadbolt home and backed away. His face hardened. He slapped the door with his palm and muttered something I didn't catch, then stomped off the porch. I listened for an engine, just sleet and wind. After a minute of quiet, I decided I'd cook and consider what to do in the morning. 15 minutes later, a second knock made me drop the frying pan. This time the sound was lower, more violent, a fist driving the wood into the frame. Porter barked, sharp and angry. Heart pounding, I grabbed my phone and saw the expected no service in the corner. I snatched up the heaviest thing within reach, a cast iron skillet still warm, and edged back to the door. Heather had installed a peephole since my childhood visits. I pressed my eye to it. 3 men stood on the porch. The man in the tan jacket hunched to the right. Beside him, 2 wore black hoodies and jeans, faces hidden behind plain cloth masks like you'd buy at a hardware store. One tapped the center panel of the door with the tip of a long knife, the blade scraping idle circles. It looked at least 8 inches. My mouth went dry. The cabin had 1 door. The windows were double-latched and old but solid. My car sat 20 yards away, nose pointing into the trees, not toward the road. Even if I made it, reversing down that narrow track in sleet, half blind with panic, was a long shot. There was nowhere to hide. 1 room, no loft, no basement. A muffled voice came through the wood. "Open up, man. Nobody has to get hurt. We just need your help." I forced my voice level. "I already called the police." A beat of silence, then a laugh from the man in tan. "No, you didn't. No service out here. You think we don't know that?" Behind me, Porter barked again. A masked man kicked the door. The frame shuddered. The top hinge squealed. On a shelf by the stove sat a half-used canister of bear spray I'd brought for hikes. I grabbed it, flipped off the safety, and aimed at the latch from 10 feet back. At that range, the canister would throw a heavy fog. "Last chance," someone outside said. I squeezed the trigger. An orange cloud blasted through the crack where wood met jam, hissing like a busted pipe. A voice on the porch screamed a curse. The door juddered under another kick. Then all 3 sets of footsteps thudded away, boots slipping on the boards. For several long seconds I heard nothing but wind, then coughing and gagging. "You idiot," someone choked, voice choked by pepper. I held the trigger until the can sputtered empty, the valve clicking dry. Then there was only my breathing and Porter whining, nails skittering on the floor. 2 minutes, maybe 3. It felt longer. Wind shook sleet off the roof. Then gravel crunched. A truck engine turned, then roared to life. Tires spat rocks. Headlights slashed across the cabin windows, lighting the ceiling in dirty amber for a heartbeat before swinging away. The engine noise faded down the road. I slid to the floor, muscles trembling. Porter pressed against me, shivering. My watch read 6:57 p.m. Less than 40 minutes had passed since the first knock. When I could stand, I pulled a fleece over Porter's back, leashed him, and cracked the door. The porch boards were slick with pepper spray, the air thick with its bite. A black pickup was already a smear of taillights between the trees. With no cell service, my only option was the pay phone at the mining museum up on County Road 4, a half-mile climb. I locked the cabin, leashed Porter, and jogged uphill through the thin air. My lungs burned. At the top, I shoved quarters into the slot and dialed 911. The Lake County dispatcher's calm voice steadied my hands. I gave the address, explained what had happened, and described the 3 men, especially the one in the tan jacket and the black pickup with a dented right fender. She told me to wait by the museum under its floodlights. Deputies were closer to me than to the cabin, and it was safer there. 20 minutes later, 2 deputies arrived, Ruiz and Harmon. They took my statement in clipped, efficient questions, then followed me back down, their cruiser's lights washing the trees in red and blue. The men, of course, were gone, but their visit was written all over the place. The door frame splintered, knife scores in the wood, pepper spray stained the porch rail. Ruiz photographed everything and bagged a balaclava someone had dropped on the porch, reeking of sweat and capsaicin. Harmon found boot prints in the mud, 3 distinct tread patterns, different sizes, and measured them. He said most midweek cabin burglaries up there happened when houses sat empty. Thieves watched for signs of tourists, then grabbed electronics and small valuables. Sometimes, he added, they knocked first to see who answered. When we tallied what was missing, the inside of the cabin was nearly untouched. The bear spray had driven them off too fast. My car hadn't been so lucky. They'd popped a door before I locked it after the first visit, taken my DSLR and 2 lenses, my laptop bag, wallet, and earbuds. Thieves like small stuff they can fence quick, Ruiz said. It stung, but I was alive and Porter was nudging my hand, still breathing. Around 10:30, Ruiz got off the radio and suggested I follow them into Leadville to finish the report. Spending the night there wasn't wise. I packed quickly, carried Porter and the essentials to the car, and locked everything. In the glow of the cruiser headlights, the porch looked almost ordinary, like nothing had just scraped its way to my threshold. I could almost see my 8-year-old self there, dropping pine cones. I took a pet-friendly motel room on Harrison Avenue and slept with Porter curled against my legs. I called my parents on the motel Wi-Fi. Dad swore softly. Mom cried. They begged me to come home in the morning. Before dawn, Ruiz called my room. State troopers had spotted a speeding black pickup near Granite that matched my description. They'd try to stop. The driver swerved, nearly clipped a guardrail, then tore on toward Buena Vista. No plate yet, no arrest. At checkout, the motel clerk handed me a paper bag. Deputies had found my wallet and camera lenses behind a gas station dumpster and dropped them at the front desk. The DSLR body and laptop were still missing. I thanked him, loaded Porter into the Subaru, and headed east. Each mile felt lighter only because I was putting distance between us and that porch. 3 weeks later, the sheriff's office called. Deputies in Salida had caught 3 men breaking into vacation homes, 2 brothers and a cousin from Pueblo. One still had raw patches on his cheeks from bear spray. In their truck, investigators found my DSLR, laptop, and an old cast iron skillet with a fresh chip in the rim. Mine. They also found multiple knives, pry bars, and an unregistered handgun. The men admitted to trolling mountain towns, watching cabin rentals, and knocking on doors with a story about leaving something behind. If no one answered or a lone traveler did, they forced their way in. They hadn't expected anyone to spray back. I retrieved my gear at the courthouse. Most of it worked despite smelling faintly of motor oil. The sheriff shook my hand and said I was lucky. I nodded, but what I felt wasn't luck, just the hollow echo of that first knock, the memory of orange spray hanging in the air, and the knowledge that if I hadn't had a half-empty can of bear deterrent on a shelf, this story might end very differently. Back in Denver, I shelved the bear spray beside my old childhood scrapbook, both artifacts from the same cabin. I haven't been back since.